What follows is a brief history of Lyndon LaRouche's concept of a U.S.-Soviet joint science driver to put an end to the Cold War. The emphasis was on developing cutting-edge technologies to be shared among the two nations and throughout the rest of the world. The adoption of this program by President Ronald Reagan changed history.
One of the other things that happened during the mid-1970s as the result of Lynn's work on science, Mr. LaRouche's work on science, is that some of the leading international scientists became very close collaborators as well. And so LaRouche and Associates launched a tax-exempt foundation called the Fusion Energy Foundation. And that became not only the most prominent organization promoting nuclear fusion and a whole array of frontier breakthroughs in science, but this also became another nest of collaboration with LaRouche of leading scientists from around the world. So issues of basic and applied science were a critical aspect of what was going on, part of the growth of the organization during the mid-1970s. And obviously, because we had put our finger on the danger of a thermonuclear war provocation coming from this trilateral commission crowd now in power in Washington, we were very attentive to this war danger on a strategic level. And so in 1977, General George Keegan, who was at the time the head of Air Force intelligence for the United States, reported on the fact that Soviet scientists were making some very extraordinary advances in the field of laser-based ballistic missile defense. The idea being that high-powered particle beam lasers, which were vastly faster than the speed of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, could be used as part of a missile defense system to literally knock out incoming ballistic missiles. And so the whole idea of bringing the most advanced technologies to bear on strategic ballistic missile defense became a very important issue, and it was clear that the Soviets were moving in a very advanced direction.
Seeing that danger coming from Moscow and Washington, independent candidate Lyndon LaRouche issued a 30-minute televised address on the eve of the 1976 presidential election. He warned of the threat coming from a Carter-Brzezinski trilateral government, whose policy, in the near term, was to start thermonuclear warfare with the Soviet Union. This warning not only stemmed the threat of thermonuclear war, but catalyzed a patriotic grouping still operating to this day within the institutions of government, military, and intelligence. This patriotic faction aided crucially in the establishment of LaRouche's Fusion Energy Foundation, which moved later to develop a nuclear beam defense program.
And LaRouche made the general conceptual point that you could bring an end to this whole period of mutually assured destruction, where basically the Soviet Union and the United States had overkill arsenals of offensive nuclear weapons. And both sides had the capacity to literally blow up the planet. And so you had a very uneasy balance of terror where the United States did not want to go too far in a confrontation with the Soviet Union because they just might blow up the world. And the same thing was true the other way.
I had been organizing the SDI operation, including initially from 1977, before it was called an SDI, long before it was called an SDI. And I was the one who said, we're going to make a project on this thing. So I adopted this and stated this as my program in 1979, when I was running as a presidential candidate. Then I had this conversation with Reagan, and then as a follow-up, after he was president, we had a follow-up with various people in the Reagan circle. including his National Security Council. And I was working with the head of the National Security Council, this operation, and with people from the CIA and this and that. I was sworn to this and sworn to that, you know. So I was doing the whole thing. And the SDI was my work, which they liked. And there was a faction, including the president, who liked it. Now, he liked it because he always hated Henry Kissinger. And he hated Henry Kissinger particularly because of what he called revenge weapons. The idea that you build super weapons, and if somebody throws a bomb at you, you obliterate the planet. That is not considered a good defense. And he was against that. And when he saw from experts that what I was saying was accepted by experts, military and others, and this was French intelligence, the leadership of the Gaullist faction in France, this was the leadership of the German military, this was the leadership of the Italian military, and all over the world. And so I was the creator of the SDI. Reagan liked it, he adopted it, and I was creating the thing in direct cooperation during the entire period with the cooperation of the National Security Council and the heads of the CIA.
This American faction was the leading opposition to the sharp right-wing turn taken under the leadership of Harry Truman. Under Truman, Roosevelt's post-war vision was sacrificed for the neo-colonialist interests of Great Britain, who went on to manufacture the dual empire adversity between the two historically cooperating superpowers. This careful balance of terror was controlled through London and involved the use of agents of influence within crucial government institutions in the United States and Russia.
In the late 1970s, people who had been leaders of OSS, which is the Roosevelt faction of the intelligence community, made a connection to me. And this former OSS faction headed up the CIA, took it over. And so it was that section, which is the World War II Roosevelt tradition inside the CIA, which was supporting with me. And we're clearing bases, when I would deal with someone in Europe, don't worry about him, don't worry, he's fine. So we had no problem in South America, similar places, none. It was clear we were actually represented power. That's why they went to kill me and so forth. It's just the reason. We represented not some guy with an idea running loose who might get picked up. No, this was power, and I was steering it. People recognized I was right. I had the scientific capability and knowledge to do it, and we were doing it. And their view was we had to be stopped.
Early on in the Reagan presidency, LaRouche was approached through an intermediary with a request from a Soviet ambassador who wanted LaRouche's appraisal of the new Reagan administration. This motion prompted LaRouche to consult his collaborators in the U.S. intelligence community on the prospects of opening a back-channel discussion with the Soviet Union. Officials at the CIA and Reagan's National Security Council helped LaRouche pursue the back channel, which he agreed to on the condition that he could engage both his U.S. and Soviet contacts in a discussion about his proposal for ballistic missile defense.
And so LaRouche was still living in New York when this whole process began in about February of 1982. But he would come down to Washington once every 4 or 6 weeks or so and would have a meeting with a designated top senior official of the Soviet embassy in Washington, and they would have their discussion, and the very next day, a senior official from the White House, usually it was a man named Richard Morris, who was the chief of security for the National Security Council when Judge William Clark was the NSC advisor to Ronald Reagan. He would come the next day, and he would receive his own report back from LaRouche. There were memos that were written to the files on this. So, there was quite an extensive volume of documentation of this back-channel discussion. And it went up to the very highest levels of the Soviet government, went up to the very highest levels of the U.S. government, and the subject matter was LaRouche's own concept of the various elements of a U.S.-Soviet collaboration on ballistic missile defense. And so among the issues that were discussed was, number one, the ability to develop systems that would actually defeat incoming nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles using ground and space-based laser components. These were systems that had not yet been even fully developed, but the mere idea of US-Soviet collaboration in the most advanced work in particle physics was already a significant step towards ending the Cold War on favorable grounds. LaRouche also said to the Soviets in very blunt terms, he said, look, you have real economic problems. You have a terrible difficulty taking this vast capability for science and translating it into technology, and you have big problems taking technologies that are developed or scientific breakthroughs that are developed in these military labs and applying them to your civilian economy. We can help you on these things. This is a win-win situation for everyone.
The offer was on the table and had the support of the Reagan administration. This proposal, which would have fundamentally reversed nearly 2 decades of physical economic decline in the U.S. and the developed world, was met with vicious opposition from Moscow and from the ranks of the Republican and Democratic Party.
In February of 1983, about a month before Ronald Reagan gave his famous March 23, 1983 speech where he announced LaRouche's SDI, he coined the term Strategic Defense Initiative, but the substance of it was LaRouche's beam defense, ballistic missile defense proposal. And so, in February of 1983, a gentleman named Mr. Sherzhnev, who was the Soviet embassy official in Washington, who had been participating in these discussions, was called back to Moscow. And he then returned to Washington, and as soon as he arrived back, he met with Mr. LaRouche, and he said, I've gotten word from the Secretary General, Yuri Andropov, that we will not accept the offer. And there are 2 primary reasons why we will not accept it. Number one, we have been told by some of our contacts here in the United States, some leading people in the Democratic Party, and by Republicans, including Henry Kissinger, that Ronald Reagan will never adopt your proposal. Therefore, we reject it first, because we're told that the U.S. really is not serious about this. But second and more important, we reject it because we realize that if your proposal is adopted, then the United States economy, with this new science driver of this groundbreaking work to be done, and the massive amounts of investment in research and development, in beam technology and other things that would go into this program, will surge ahead of us economically.
On March 23, 1983, 1 month after the Soviet leadership rejected the beam defense proposal proffered through the LaRouche back channel, Reagan delivered a historic speech. He announced that the United States would move ahead with what he named the Strategic Defense Initiative, an offer not for confrontation, but for collaboration.
I clearly recognize that defensive systems have limitations and raise certain problems and ambiguities. If paired with offensive systems, they can be viewed as fostering an aggressive policy, and no one wants that. But with these considerations firmly in mind, I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
We found out several years later, in fact, during the railroad trial of Lyndon LaRouche in Alexandria, Virginia, in 1988, that Reagan was almost prevented from giving that SDI speech. The text was drafted, and we knew the people. We were in close contact with literally the people that drafted that section of the speech for Judge Clark. And at that time, the White House Chief of Staff was James Baker III. He was an opponent of this whole LaRouche proposal. When he saw the final draft speech, he removed that section. Traditionally, the White House Chief of Staff was the last person to edit the speech before it was given to the President for final review, before he went on television. Judge Clark found out that Baker had removed the critical 3 minutes from the end of the speech and violated all protocol and did an end run around Baker and went directly to the president and said, "Mr. President, here's the other version of the speech, which has the SDI section in it. Which do you want to give?" And he said, "I want to give this one." That was Reagan's decision. And so that night, when Reagan got on television, probably one of the most shocked and surprised people on the face of the earth was James Baker III, because he thought he had killed this thing. So that's irony number one of the situation. The second irony is that the whole concept of SDI was such a shock to the media, to the so-called Republican think tank community, the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise, all of these groups, that when the major news outlets called them up to find out, you know, who could get on television the next morning and talk about this SDI speech by Reagan, they all confessed total ignorance. And one of them at least had the dignity to say, well, the only people that know about this is the LaRouche people, the Fusion Energy Foundation, call them up.
LaRouche's organization took this opportunity to educate the American people on the prospects of President Reagan's SDI proposal. LaRouche made the SDI a cornerstone of his 1984 presidential campaign, at a time when the fear that the Soviets were on their way to winning the Cold War was at its height. He discussed the mutual benefits of this program of joint economic development, which required the full utilization of the vast military supremacy of both nations.
If we take 3 courses of action, there is still time to save the United States from Soviet domination. First, we must abandon the insane doctrine of nuclear deterrence, just as President Reagan proposed on March 23rd last year. Second, we must develop rapidly a first generation of strategic ballistic missile defense capable of destroying not less than 40% of all of the Soviet missiles which might be launched against the United States or our allies. And we must continue to develop and deploy improved systems which will destroy over 95% of all such missiles. Thirdly, we must change our monetary and economic policies toward both our allies and toward developing nations generally. We must promote rapid technological progress in agriculture and basic industry among all those nations which are either our military allies or merely friendly republics. We must build a wall of steel, a great wall of powerful economic progress around the Soviet Union. If we take these 3 sets of measures, we still have time to survive. We must rebuild our economy today, as President Roosevelt rebuilt our economy during the period 1939 through 1943. If we do not take such measures, the United States will not survive much past the present decade, at best. Anti-missile beam weapons fall into 2 general classes. In the first class, a laser beam burns a hole in the missile or warhead. In the second class, the beam striking the missile creates a shock effect, so that the metal or ceramic of the missile seems to explode. In the second class, a beam carrying a punch of a few thousand kilowatts in a pulse of less than 1/1000th of a second can destroy any missile or warhead which the Soviets might shoot up. If we equip these beams with efficient detection and aiming systems, these beams can be fired accurately at a missile from more than 1,000 miles away. These are the most powerful weapons ever developed. Lasers fire at the speed of light, and in the best case, a pulse of less than 1/1000th of a second can destroy any missile the Soviets could deploy. The method we must use is called layered strategic ballistic missile defense. The first line of defense is beam weapons, which are assigned to destroy Soviet missiles at the moment those missiles are launched. The second line of defense is beam weapons assigned to destroy Soviet missiles in those missiles' highly vulnerable boost phase. The third line of defense is beam weapons assigned to hit repeatedly at all Soviet missiles and deployed warheads in the stratosphere. The fourth line of defense includes special effects bombs, which detonate above the level of our atmosphere, which will cause incoming warheads to tumble and therefore to burn up as they enter the atmosphere. The fifth line of defense is ground-based beam weapon systems assigned to destroy warheads as they descend through the atmosphere. The final line of defense includes throwing everything, including the kitchen sink if need be, to destroy a warhead before it reaches its target.
This was a turning point in history. And of course, LaRouche understood that if it was not possible to convince the Soviets to reverse their stupid decision not to go with cooperation, he knew that the Soviet Union was doomed because he knew Ronald Reagan, and Reagan was going to go ahead with this, and the U.S. was going to spend a lot of money and would seek out collaboration in Europe with Japan and others. And if the Soviets did not become full participants and partners in this, it was going to become a competitive defensive arms race. And if the Soviets, with their closed economy, were forced to try to compete in this extremely expensive and demanding program, he knew that their economy would blow apart. And so in May of 1983, for the first time, LaRouche warned that if the Soviets don't wise up and change their mind and accept this offer from Ronald Reagan, then he gave the Soviet system about another 5 years before it would collapse, because it could not sustain itself in the face of a competitive defensive arms race with the United States and the West. And so, precisely on that time frame, 5-6 years, that was when the Soviet system began coming unglued for precisely the reasons that LaRouche warned about.
As the Soviet Comecon began to collapse, the one person who represented the only possible alternative to that disintegrating system was targeted by George H.W. Bush and thrown into prison in what has been called the greatest and longest-running government frame-up against a political figure in known U.S. history. The message was sent to his followers and collaborators that if they stuck out their necks as LaRouche had done, they would be targeted and eliminated. Once Ronald Reagan left the White House, George Bush Sr. killed the SDI and proceeded to lay the grounds for the ongoing global crisis launched in the period of 1989 to 1992.
We were committed to this alternative, this proposal for this to the Soviet Union. Well, SDI. SDI was a political solution as well as a military solution. All right, so what did they do? They took us out. And what they did to a lot of other of my friends who were older, they eliminated the factor of the people who would have done what I would have done. Systematically. Just eliminated them. Like an intelligence operation. You go in and you wipe out people. Kill them. Get rid of them. You've got a new government. You've taken over. And the public and institutions being what they are, being cowardly, they accept orders from the new masters. So you eliminate dissent by killing off the people who are credible dissenters. It's that simple. The tragedy was essentially earlier. It occurred in 1983. It occurred with a Kennedy. Ted Kennedy was key in this. Other people were key. The Bushes were key. Reagan was willing to go. There were problems with him, but he was willing to go. We had pieces all in place. We had command structure, everything in place to make this thing work. And by the time we got the opportunity to make it work, we were eliminated. And everyone that was close to me in the operation, with a few exceptions here and there, but in general, all these people were worked on in Germany and elsewhere and told, you never talk to him again. And the same thing goes on today. That's why I'm always talking through intermediaries, because they're ever afraid of talking to me, afraid of what will happen to them if they start talking to me. So the way I work with them the way I do. You have to act like a conspirator. There's no way you can do it. And you're up against this kind of thing.